It's 2 stories tall and about 50 feet long. I can see 3 broken windows and a door on the bottom floor. There are 2 windows upstairs, and they look like they're boarded up. There's a column of brick that sticks up from the eastern end of the roof, just north of its center. The paint is long gone, and the wooden exterior appears ashen brown in color. There's a pine tree that has grown tall and crooked out front, and an old silo out back. To the east is a shed, and its roof has begun to collapse, and its sides have buckled under its weight. These remnants of a home sit nestled amongst a mixture of pine and deciduous trees, the leaves having fallen months ago, and the grass is dormant and brown. One can imagine the history of this home, the children running in and out of the front door during a warm spring day as the grass begins to green. I can imagine a tire swing dangling from a sturdy branch on one of the many trees that pepper the farmstead, and the sound of the family dog barking as a car passes out front. I can imagine the sound of children's laughter as they chase each other around the yard, or the panicked cry when one became stuck climbing a tree. It's a picture I took of an old farmhouse that sits west of Irene, South Dakota. I was traveling to Yankton, and it caught my eye, so I pulled over and took a picture. Had I not had a picture to look at, I don't think I would have been able to describe it, as my memory would have faded away. Memories are a strange thing. Some things we can barely recall, while others sear themselves into our brains and mark us forever. Scientists tell us that the more significant the emotional change when we experience something, the more likely we are to remember it. I didn't know the significance when I took the picture, but it was here, across the street from the old farmstead, where Nancy Haas first learned that Tammy was missing. This is the Footsteps in the Dark podcast, Season 1, Tammy Haas, Episode 4, and I'm your host, Chad Zimmerman. If you want to see the pursuit for truth in Tammy's case continue, please consider supporting us. You can do this in a number of different ways. First, you can join our Patreon site. This is where you'll find all of the in-depth analysis that went into our conclusions and lots of behind-the-scenes information. You can support us by buying merchandise, or you can donate. All of these options can be found on our website at footstepsinthedarkpodcast.com. And if you like the song by John Slap Myers, Tammy's Ghost, that we use at the end of each episode as a prelude to the next, please download it. It's just 99 cents and you can find it on iTunes. And as always, we thank you for your support. It really does mean everything to us. This podcast contains themes and language intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised. On Friday, September 25th, 1992, just 2 days after Tammy was found at the bottom of a steep ravine, authorities impounded Eric Stukel's car. The same day, investigators found a few hairs in the trunk, leading to speculation that Tammy had been in the trunk. It would be weeks before the crime lab would be able to investigate other pieces of forensic evidence, and investigators began interviewing anyone that might know something, and focused heavily on Eric Stukel. Based on interview notes and never-before-seen case reports, Eric's alibi goes something like this. He states he picked up Tammy around 5:30 p.m. at her Aunt Vicki's, and they went to Pizza Hut where they both had spaghetti and meatball dinners with Mountain Dew. A receipt was recovered and indicates that the meal was paid for at 6:35 p.m. They left Pizza Hut and drove the 10 blocks back to Eric's house in Eric's silver 1988 Chevy Beretta, and they watched TV before heading to the high school for the homecoming coronation activities, and were seen by a number of Tammy's friends. After coronation, they headed out to an area known as the Dead End Road, which is a spot outside of town where kids would meet and party that was outside of the watchful eye of law enforcement. It's here where Eric's friend Dusty would tell Eric that Dan Stevenson was throwing a party at their family's vacant farmhouse outside of Crofton, Nebraska. Eric and Tammy would leave and stop at the Cork and Bottle, where Tammy would speak with Pam Altenberg and ask her if she would sell her some alcohol, and Pam refuses. They would leave there and head to the Pump and Stuff gas station located close to the Meridian Bridge that crosses into Nebraska. Tammy would purchase cigarettes and 2 6-packs of beer. Moosehead for Eric, and Bud Light for Tammy. They would then cross the bridge and head to the Stevenson farm, arriving around 10 p.m. If you're new to this podcast and did not listen to episode 2, please go back and listen. It's during this episode that we cover the timeline of the party. According to Eric's early interviews, he states they left the party at 10:45 p.m. and went back to Yankton, where they saw Todd O'Brien's vehicle parked at the Cork and Bottle gas station on Broadway Avenue. Since Eric knew they could purchase alcohol from Todd, they stopped and bought a 12-pack of Miller Genuine Draft Light and went back to his house, arriving no later than 11 p.m. According to Eric, he and Tammy made love, and Tammy got dressed and left around 12:30 to walk back to her Aunt Vicki's to be home in time for a 1 a.m. curfew, but never made it. Law enforcement immediately began checking Eric's alibi. They found the receipt for the spaghetti dinners at Pizza Hut, interviewed witnesses who saw them at Coronation and the Dead End Road, as well as the Stevenson farm. Based upon the records I was able to uncover, the place to start begins the moment they left the party, because her body was found just a little over a mile from the farmhouse. The first element, their departure time of 10:45, is false. By cross-referencing the dozens of reports from party attendees, Eric and Tammy left around 11:20. Again, this is covered in episode 2. Law enforcement also discovered that Todd O'Brien, the person who Eric stated sold them a 12-pack of MGD Light, was not working at Cork and Bottle that night, and instead was working his regular job as an overnight machine operator at Yeagy's Grain and Feed. A check of his time card corroborated this, and incidentally, Sergeant Ensenbach of the Yankton Police Department had run a vehicle check on a car sitting outside of Yeagy's Grain and Feed on the night Tammy disappeared, and the red 1985 Toyota was registered to Todd O'Brien. Bolstering his alibi was Eric's sister, Sarah, who also had a room in the basement of their house. She would state she remembers hearing Eric come home that night and hearing one set of feet leaving later. She remembered this as being around 11 p.m. Her story would change and improve over the years, getting more detailed with each telling. She would later recall hearing Eric's fingernails scratching the wall as he came down the steps, and a woman's voice. And she would recall having to get up in the middle of the night to urinate and being startled by running into Tammy as Tammy came out of the bathroom wearing Eric's black robe. Another added detail omitted from earlier interviews was that she stated her boyfriend, Patrick, was staying over that night and he'd fallen asleep around 11 p.m., and she awoke him to tell him that Tammy had startled her. However, in an October 1st, 1992 interview, Patrick, Sarah's boyfriend, would tell investigator John Dalziel that he was at her house until 11 p.m. On May 14th, 1993, Patrick would tell investigator Mike Mosier that he left at 11 p.m. that night, but had told people that he saw Eric at the house that night. But he would admit in the interview that he hadn't seen Eric's car. This brings up an important question. If Eric didn't arrive until after Patrick fell asleep, why would Patrick comment on not seeing Eric's car, unless Patrick actually left around 11 p.m.? While this part of the alibi had its issues, there was another person who claims to have seen Tammy that night, and it was after Tammy left Eric's. According to gas station clerk Jennifer Jones, Tammy walked into the Pump and Stuff gas station for a second time that evening and bought a Diet Mountain Dew in a bottle and asked if they had any chocolate pies. She was alone and stated that nobody else was in the store at the same time. She states they talked about Matt Jones. Tammy had a cigarette and mentioned she'd been on a 30-day bender, a detail that would be found in a letter she wrote to her friend Michelle and had mailed the same day. And while this detail would lend credibility to her, it was what she remembered Tammy wearing that caused Jennifer to remain the linchpin witness for Eric's alibi. In her September 26, 1992 statement, she recalls Tammy wearing a dark blue denim shirt, khaki pants, brown penny loafers, white socks, and a black purse, nearly identical to what Tammy was found wearing when her body was discovered. In addition, receipts were turned over to police the day after she was found, and there were 2 sales around 1 a.m. in the morning, each for 75 cents, the same price as a bottle of soda. If Eric's alibi is true, and Tammy did leave that night, then what happened to Tammy, and by who? Other suspects would emerge early during the investigation. The first was Tammy's other boyfriend, Rob. If you recall, Tammy and Rob met near the beginning of her freshman year at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. After dropping out of college at the end of the year, Tammy and Rob kept dating. However, it wouldn't take long for the distance to become a problem, and Tammy started seeing Eric, and Rob didn't know. If you recall from episode 2, Tammy had broken up with Eric and Rob in August of 1992 and developed an interest in Sean Coles that began at the August 28th Lollapalooza concert in the Twin Cities. It was shortly after this concert, on September 1st, that Rob drove from Lincoln to Yankton and picked Tammy up late at night and drove her back to Lincoln, arriving around 5:30 a.m., and she stayed a few days. However, after returning on September 4th, she ended up at Sean Cole's house the next night, and they had sex. As details began to emerge regarding Tammy's romantic life, investigators decided they needed to zero in on the other men in her life, and interviews were conducted with Rob, Sean, and Todd. This is Todd Nielsen, and although they broke up years before she died, law enforcement still wanted to question Todd.
Oh, God. It makes me, you have to understand, like, I get that I was Tammy's ex-boyfriend. I get that I was a suspect. I get that. Like, there's no reason why I shouldn't have been a suspect. I was an ex-boyfriend. But, like, even when the FBI came to talk to me at work that day, I willingly went with them to the federal building, and they hooked me up to a lie detector test, and, I was treated so badly. I thought, like, they're going to pin this on me and I'm going to jail forever, you know? Like, I was so scared. I can't even tell you. I was 22 years old. That's pretty young to be, like, hooked up to a lie detector test and, like, being questioned like you're a killer when I had nothing to do with it. It was devastating, and quite honestly, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of hurt right now, but it's affected me. I don't doubt that at all. I'm sorry. It's been really hard because, there's just no way. I really did think that I was going to get paid for it, but, because you hear about that all the time. But, like, I'm devastated.
One by one, the alibis of Tammy's exes would be checked and polygraphs would be conducted, and they would be crossed off the suspect list. Neither Todd or Rob were anywhere near Yankton, South Dakota that evening. Sean Cole said he had seen Tammy earlier that day, around 4:30, but that was the last he'd seen her, and his alibi checked out. Within a few weeks of discovering Tammy's body, investigators of multiple offices were interviewing anyone that might have information, particularly those who were at the Stevenson farm the night Tammy disappeared. This resulted in dozens of interviews. While most of the teenagers and young adults interviewed didn't have any specific information, they did pass along what they'd been hearing. It was within these early reports that I noticed a trend, and that trend still exists to this day. There were two names that were mentioned the most to law enforcement agencies: Eric Stukel and Mike Cruz. Mike Cruz was Tammy's Aunt Vicki's boyfriend at the time and was living with her. As you may recall, Tammy had been bouncing around living at different homes that summer because she and her mom were not seeing eye to eye. Tammy moved in with her Aunt Vicki and Mike on September 11th, just 6 days before going missing. Mike's reputation in 1992 seems on par with what I still hear from people today. He's not a good guy. The early reports contained rumors and claims that he'd raped women, and since Tammy was found with her pants down, Mike seemed like a possible match. 30 years later, Mike's name is still mentioned frequently. Throughout this investigation, I've asked people what they know about Mike Cruz, and it follows closely to what I've read, that he's not a good guy, that drugs are involved, and he's abusive. Since he was living with Tammy's aunt, it wasn't a very big leap to believe that he may have come across Tammy that night and that something bad happened as a result of it. It's possible that Tammy could have told him where she'd been earlier, giving Mike enough information to make sure she ends up close to the party, and putting the suspicion back onto Eric. This wasn't outlandish and seemed like a real possibility, and thus needed to try and figure out more about his alibi. The records I was able to locate do not contain any investigative reports on Mike Cruz, so I ran into a wall there. Scrolling through the old Facebook posts from 2015 and 2016, I was able to come across one post that seemed to contain specific information regarding Mike Cruz at that time. It said he was working for Williams Brothers Construction building a gymnasium in Salem, South Dakota, about 60 miles away at the time Tammy disappeared. In addition, Tammy's Aunt Vicki testified in the 1996 trial that Mike Cruz was working out of town that week and was usually gone by 7 a.m. and would return around 5 or 6 p.m. She further testified that Mike was at home with her the night she disappeared, and Mike had passed the polygraph examination. Beyond the information at trial, Eric Stukel's own attorney, Mike Stevens, made absolutely no attempt to draw attention to Mike Cruz as a suspect, nor was Mike Cruz called to testify at Eric's trial. Because of this lack of interest in Mike Cruz at the time of the trial, I moved past Mike Cruz as a suspect. As the investigation moved forward and possible suspects were crossed off the list, law enforcement was busy going through the physical evidence. Tammy's clothing, fingernail clippings, hair combings, and hair samples were taken. Eric's car was seized. His bedroom was searched, as well as blood and hair samples obtained. The Stevenson farm and farmhouse was searched. Evidence was secured, bagged, and sent to the crime lab for analysis, and slowly, a picture started to emerge. Tammy's clothing had been sent to the Nebraska State Crime Lab, where Michael Oughton would examine her clothing for trace evidence. This involved using a stainless steel spatula-type device and gently scraping the articles of clothing and collecting any debris that remained, and then analyzing the debris for evidentiary concerns. During his analysis of Tammy's pants, several small, yellow, single-layer paint flakes with reflective beads were discovered. The same type of paint used to paint yellow stripes on paved roads. The presence of these indicated to law enforcement that she was dragged across a road with a yellow stripe. Highway 121, the road next to the ravine where she was discovered, had double yellow lines painted on the road above where she was found. Sandburrs had been found embedded into the crotch area of Tammy's underwear. Hair was found in the trunk of Eric's car, consistent with Tammy's. And the small red plastic particle was found on Tammy's shirt, and several more were found in the trunk of Eric's car, despite the fact that Eric was seen cleaning his car the day after Tammy disappeared. Lastly, small fibers were found on Tammy's clothing, and after careful analysis by Michael Oughton, were determined to be fibers consistent with the trunk mat in Eric's car. Along with the analysis of debris and fibers recovered from her clothing, the Nebraska State Crime Lab would analyze her clothing for bodily fluids. Dr. Rena Roy was tasked with examining several items for blood, urine, and semen. During her analysis, a large urine stain was discovered on the back of Tammy's pants. One spot of dried urine was found on the back of Tammy's underwear. Semen was discovered on a vaginal swab submitted for analysis. None of Tammy's urine, nor was any semen found on her underwear. However, this was the early 90s, and testing of fluids yielded limited information compared with today's trace DNA capabilities. The fluid evidence was submitted for blood typing, secretor status, and other tests, and this yielded curious results. While the urine on the underwear and semen on the vaginal swab taken at autopsy were consistent with Eric Stukel, the urine on the pants was not, and came from someone else altogether, adding more mystery to the case, and speculation that perhaps someone had urinated on Tammy's pants, possibly after she died, and was placed in the ravine since no stains of that type were found on her underwear. However, it would be during the forensic examination of Eric's car that investigators would find another odd clue. Urine all over the passenger side of Eric's car, and this urine would match the urine on Tammy's pants. The answer to the mysterious urine would occur when teenagers who attended the party at the Stevenson farm were interviewed. Just prior to Eric and Tammy leaving the house that night, 4 teenage boys, Tyler, Jamie, Chad, and John, who had arrived before Eric and Tammy and parked ahead of them, were leaving and came across Eric's car. Jamie, who didn't like Eric, saw that the passenger window was down and opened the door, and urinated all over the passenger side of the car. The urine on Tammy's pants came from James when she sat in it as they were leaving the party. Community speculation over the years has led to rumors that perhaps something happened to trigger Eric when Tammy sat in the urine, and he got mad and hit her, leading to her injuries. However, after reviewing dozens of witness statements from the 64 people that had been to the Stevenson farm that night, there is no mention of anyone seeing something happen. And when you consider that 10 to 15 other people were still milling around and heading to their cars in close proximity, it suggests that whatever happened did not happen at the farm. The chances of others seeing something and not talking about it for 30 years would be highly unlikely. With the urine stain on the pants eliminated for evidentiary value, The suspect list also narrows. As the evidence pointing towards Eric began to mount, his family's concern began to increase. In an early interview with Detective Bill Miller, Eric's mother, Dawn, quickly dismissed the hair found in the trunk, since she had lived at the Stukels for a month that summer and used Eric's car for 2 weeks. She also acknowledged that Eric and Tammy fought all the time, but she was not aware of anything physical. In July of 1993, she would tell Police Chief Leon Yankton that Eric was an honest young man and didn't know anything, and if he did, he would have told her. According to her, they wanted to see this resolved as quickly as anyone else. Yet there was just one problem. The evidence seemed to point towards Eric, but Eric wasn't talking. There was a point, however, when some in law enforcement thought the break might come, and it was early on. Here's former Sheriff's Deputy Shane Topel.
A little bit better with Eric than most. I was a fairly young officer at the time, and one of the things was, as you're getting to, interview somebody, you talk about music and things like this, and he and I like some of the same music, and so that was, kind of a connection, and so it seemed like, he was more willing to talk to me than he was others. Well, later on that summer, that next summer, I was on patrol near Mission Hill, South Dakota, and he actually stopped me and talked to me. And, at that time, working with the FBI, we were under some rules as to how we could, or as my interpretation, we were under rules as to how we could talk to a suspect who had an attorney. And so, when I talked to him, it was in, very vague references, but, he was basically lamenting, how his life was destroyed, and he, since then gotten the tattoo of, he used to call her Tia, and he had this big tattoo on his shoulder of her. And anyhow, he was, still hanging out with the same group of guys that he'd been hanging out with, that prior fall. They all lived in a house in Mission Hill outside of Yankton, and I thought, well, we've got him talking here, and I think we better call in, the lead investigator on this, and get him to sit down with Eric. Well, the guy that they sent up was an officer who, he was probably, he was probably a pretty good officer, but I think there might have been somebody that would have connected with him better. And the next day he did agree to talk with us, but was extremely defensive. And the guy that Nebraska sent up, and I couldn't remember his name for the life of me, but the guy that Nebraska sent up, I don't think he connected very well with Eric, and I would say the interview was kind of a bust. And probably could have been, there were probably a couple things that in retrospect I wish we'd have done differently. Frankly, I probably should have just, because I got along with him, I probably should have just conducted the interview and been very straightforward, and not given a whole lot of regard to what the FBI's rules were as far as communicating with somebody who had an attorney. But Eric then seemed to close up, and I never had another conversation with him again.
One must wonder if, in this moment of law enforcement's lack of clarity and understanding what happened to Tammy, if Eric saw this uncertainty as an opportunity and stopped talking, and put everything on the shoulders of law enforcement to put the pieces together. As the investigation continued, it would be trying to get the pieces to fit that law enforcement would struggle with the most. Based upon an October 7th, 1992 report, significant attempts to link her injuries to a car surfing accident would be undertaken. The report discusses the mechanics of two types of scenarios, where Tammy could fall from standing on top of a moving car. Theory A involves a female standing on top of the car as the car lurches forward. It says, quote, assuming the female could not react in time to maintain her position on top of the vehicle, the most likely way she would fall would be opposite of the direction of the vehicle moved. Therefore, it would give the impression of the female falling backwards. The forward motion of the vehicle would bring the female's feet forward out from under the female's center of gravity. There would be a downward shift in her center of gravity, falling down. The buttocks of the female would probably next come in contact with the surface, roof, to the rear of where the female was standing. The upper body of the female would probably develop a rearward and downward gravitation. Due to the sloping lines of the car body involved, the body would slide down the slope of the rear window to the trunk deck area. The female would be sliding on her back. The head of the female would contact the flattened surface of the trunk deck, stopping the downward gravitation. The low momentum of the body would most likely result in the body doing a backward somersault. This would be the lower body rotating over the front of the body towards the top of the head. The back of the head being supported by the trunk deck would be the pivot point. The area including the upper cervical spine could possibly rotate past its maximum flex and result in an injury to that area. The lower portion would continue over, and the front part of the legs would probably make contact with the rear area of the deck trunk. Gravity would take over again, and the body slides off the rear of the vehicle to the surface of the ground below. It would depend on the forward speed/momentum of the body as to the injury to the body. A very slow speed would probably not result in much injury. An abrasion or abrasions could be expected. Small amounts of surface particle would be expected to be found in the clothing and possibly on the exposed skin. Lacerations would be highly probable if the body contacted a hard surface from speeds of 5 miles an hour or higher. The higher the speed involved, the degree of injury and or trauma would increase. End quote. Theory B puts a person sitting on top of the car facing forward with the same type of forward movement of the car. It's in this second scenario that an interesting detail emerges. It says, both theories could explain the neck injury and the deposit of human hair on the rear bumper and rear face of the trunk deck. Human hair on the rear bumper and rear face of the trunk deck? I began scouring through the records I found in Nebraska and did find a report that mentions fiber samples from those areas. In a report dated November 1st, 1992, it says the fibers recovered from those areas did not match fiber samples taken from Tammy's clothes. In another report dated July 6th, 1993, a plastic bag containing 4 boxes labeled 8A through D, each containing a strand of hair, were examined. Boxes B and C were of animal hair, but boxes A and D were Caucasian human hair. However, both were considered unsuitable for comparison purposes by the Nebraska State Crime Lab. Although the report does not indicate where the hair was collected, I was able to find notes regarding evidence when it was returned from Nebraska to Yankton County, and it lists 4 boxes containing hair from a Beretta. As I sifted through pages from the Nebraska Crime Lab, I became very frustrated due to the lack of scientific technology at the time. Without a root on recovered hair, DNA testing could not be performed, and very limited information could be gleaned. Size, color, diameter, and whether it was Caucasian was about all that could be determined. And every report ended with the stock phrase, quote, "It should be noted, hairs do not possess sufficient characteristics to identify them as unique to a particular individual to the exclusion of all others." End quote. The language in the reports was deflating regarding the hair evidence, and it almost reads like the lab trying to say, "Stop sending us hair samples, they're worthless." When investigators visited the Stevenson farm, they discovered a second-story window had been left open, or had been opened sometime after most everyone left. This led to speculation that someone had been locked inside of the house, despite clear statements from witnesses that saw Eric and Tammy heading towards their car. Stains on Tammy's pants were speculated to have come from falling from the upstairs window, and possibly hitting a roof from an adjacent first-floor room. A shingle sample was taken and compared to the stains on her pants, but tests eliminated the shingle as a source for the stain. They couldn't find asphalt material in the stains. The results of the test indicated that the stain was plant matter. Many fibers found were considered to be so common in color, diameter, and fiber makeup as to deem them worthless for comparison purposes. As a result, the limited value to the forensic evidence left a large gap in knowledge, a gap that would have to be filled by the person that was with her and the person that pulled Tammy across the road into the ravine. With the limited evidence they had still pointing at Eric, the hope was that Eric would eventually talk, and significant focus had been put on increasing the pressure on him to see if he'd crack, and this began early in the investigation. This was evident in a memo dated October 14, 1992, pertaining to suggestions made on October 1st and 2nd, where investigators prepared for an interview with Eric by consulting with another investigator for strategies. The strategies could be used to increase the likelihood of a positive outcome. In other words, a confession. Some of the strategies included reviewing the tape of his earlier interviews and review an entry he wrote in a journal at a party after Tammy was found. The investigator recommended using a soft approach using soft words, and told them not to use words like kill and murder, and to hold off issuing a search warrant for his home until they knew whether he'd confess or not. They were instructed on subconscious signaling, and recommended using a timeline with a gap between his known whereabouts filled with the phrase time of death / body placement written in the gap. They filled room with props such as folders that said body fluid results and hair and fiber examination results, pictures of his car trunk and front seat, and they recommended having pictures of the body dump site on hand in the event of a confession. They were told to use questioning such as, why would Tammy's hair be found in your trunk? Who would you suspect? In addition, they were told to try and relate to him and let him know they understand what it's like to have sleepless nights, loss of appetite, and knots in the stomach. To begin the interview, investigators had Eric ride along as he instructed them on their route and activities on September 17, 1992. Not much varies in the report from other reports. Eric maintains they left the farmhouse between 10:45 and 11, which, as we learned earlier, is about a half an hour earlier than what reports conclude. He does clear up a discrepancy, that they did not stop at the Cork and Bottle on the way back. After returning from the ride-along, they return to the law enforcement center where the interview continues inside. And this is where the interview report ends, presumably because another jurisdiction picked up once inside, so we don't know what was discussed inside. However, in other reports, it is noted that the interview was terminated following some kind of emotional change in Eric Stukel, and his father terminated the interview. Over the next few days, law enforcement would execute a search warrant for his home and his school locker, as well as put him under surveillance. Meanwhile, the Nebraska Crime Lab was working through the physical evidence. Apart from the hair found in the trunk mentioned earlier, 3 notable discoveries started to add up. The yellow reflective paint flakes were found on her pants, suggesting she'd been dragged across the yellow center line of the road. Fibers consistent with Eric's trunk mat were found on her clothing. And small, red plastic particles were discovered in his trunk, with 1 or 2 matching particles found on Tammy's clothing. Subjected to microscopic analysis and pyrolysis composition analysis, they all matched. And this meant Tammy had been put in the trunk of Eric's car. And this is where the case stalled. They had a who, but were not able to answer the remaining questions of how, what, when, why, or where. Since she was found so close to the location of the party, it has always been assumed that whatever happened must have happened there. But without any evidence of what caused her injuries, law enforcement would be left speculating. In early 1994, a grand jury was convened and a case was presented. The grand jury was able to eliminate the car surfing scenario, but beyond that, little is known about the grand jury proceedings, other than they did not recommend charges due to insufficient evidence. Despite wiring up Tammy's mother and Josh, the server that heard the alleged restaurant booth confession, nothing else would come to light, and the same questions remained, and things got quiet. The lack of action in the case caused family friend Gary Itt to take action.
When this happened in '92, of course, it was concerning, but it was more of a casual interest in it, just to know what's going on, because I continue to think, well, this will be resolved. They'll find out how it happened and who did it and whatever the situation is. So in '92, I just kind of figured law enforcement would handle it. Well, then it got to be a year went by and another year went by, and the interest in the case continued. So then move that forward 2.5 years to early 1995, and nothing was happening in my visual. At that point, I still never really, in any kind of detail, talked to the family, to the Haas family. So I felt a sense of calling. I mean, I don't know how else to put it, a burden. You feel a little bit the same way, maybe in a different way, but same way. Somebody needs to do something. Nothing's happening. We're not getting any information. Surely there has to be enough to at least put attention on somebody and get to the bottom of this.
Out of the frustration for lack of answers, Gary would help form a public awareness group.
Pulse, I'm sorry, PULSE. And I defined that it stood for Public Understanding, Let the Silence End. So we formed the Pulse group and we started meeting in April, I believe was the first meeting at the church of 95, and started forming some direction. And the first activity we really did was put some very rough posters together. And we put those out and went to businesses and places around town and asked if they would put it up. Any information, relative to Tammy's death. And so that was the Pulse group poster. And that was in July of 95. And then from there, I kind of took the leadership in the group, not only holding the meetings every month, informing the group as to what we determined was going on. Then I personally went to meet with the state's attorney at the time, which was Mike Ridgway. Mike Ridgway was the Yankton County state's attorney.
With the statute of limitations set to expire in September 1995 for lesser charges such as manslaughter, law enforcement worked tirelessly to try and answer more of the questions. With the idea still in mind that whatever happened must have happened at the farmhouse, investigators kept applying pressure to Eric's friends, believing someone must know something. This is Katie Larson, one of Tammy's friends who was at the party that night.
Did you ever feel like early on that they were coming after you, like that they felt you knew something?
Kinda. I remember standing there and I know my mom was standing around the corner. And she's like, Kate. She calls me Kate. What is, that's not fair. Yeah, I don't, man, that was so long ago. But yeah, they would just show up and it was, whoa. I think we just had the cops and the FBI in our houses so much that I can't, think about what the people were thinking. Because I know the FBI and the cops were at my house all the time. They all tell me that I was there and I wasn't. And my mom can vouch for it too because I had a curfew that night and she's like, what are you doing home an hour early? And I said, well, I was the driver and everybody else in my car had to be home. So I came home from that party.
The Nebraska State Patrol went so far as to track down Eric's best friend, Jason, while he was working in Omaha.
When I was working down in Omaha at First Data Resources. Mm-hmm. And, the two stadies from Nebraska came down and gave me the working over. Right, yeah, with the Polaroid book. That's something that I can't ever erase. I wish I could. That's a bad one. Little good cop, bad cop. Yeah.
Did they do that more than once that way, or just the one time?
Like with the dead picture book once. That was enough. That's when that pretty much dropped out of college and all that shit. That was the end of me. Yeah. The innocence of youth is, ripped away from you real easy. The investigations to get you to break, they're effective. they're really effective. And then when you don't have anything to break, you break yourself. That's the bad part. That's what the really frustrating part is you try to. That was our problem from the beginning. Is we were too honest. We said too much to the police. We said every question that they asked us, we answered truthfully, and that was our demise. Should have said, what the fuck's that have to do with anything but off? No, and none of us had attorneys or anything when we went in to talk because we didn't have anything to hide.
With each interview, investigators found themselves in the same spot. stuck with a highly circumstantial case with too many unanswered questions. On September 6, 1995, investigators tracked Eric down in the Twin Cities and tried to approach him with a deal, a technique known as the Reed technique, a highly controversial technique that leads to a disproportionately higher rate of false confessions. The investigators began by letting Eric know that charges might be filed soon in the case to raise his anxiety. Then, investigators told him they thought it just looked like an accident, and if it was, and Eric would tell them, they'd work diligently to prove that. Instead, Eric denied any involvement. Investigators then went over various theories and rumors, and Yankton Police Department Detective Mike Mosier interjected and told him that he thought it just looked like an accident. This got to Eric, and he snapped at Mosier and said, quote, "I don't care about your opinion," end quote. At this point, Sheriff Hunoff and Sergeant Hilges redirected Eric's attention to his failed polygraph, and this kept Eric's attention. It's during this part of the interview that Eric interjects something strange. He tells investigators that every time he was interviewed, he was either high or drunk, except for when he took the first polygraph. The interview continues, and Eric expresses the desire to take another polygraph, and investigators acknowledge he could, but then they show them their hand and tell him that the line of questioning would change from, "Did you kill Tammy Haas?" to something along the lines of, whether or not he provided accurate information pertaining to whether Tammy was alive or injured the last time he saw her. When I read this, I was blown away. Why would investigators forewarn him in this situation and potentially raise Eric's anxiety? Why not play it cool and just get him to the polygraph, and then ask the question? Sunday, September 10th at 2 p.m. was agreed upon, and Eric assured officers that he could make it there. But the date and time came and went, and after a couple of hours of waiting, investigators gave up. Eric decided not to show. The next day, investigators were able to reach Eric, and he said he was having car trouble and couldn't afford gas, and investigators told him they could help reimburse travel expenses. Eric said he wanted to talk to his parents, and that he'd call back in a couple of hours. He never called back. Investigators tried calling 3 times the next day without success. Finally, the day after, September 13th, investigators were notified that Eric was now represented by an attorney, and all future contact by law enforcement with Eric should be directed through his attorney. When I read this, it reminded me of something former Sheriff's Deputy Shane Topol had mentioned to me about Eric searching to find an attorney. Shane knew one of the attorneys Eric had spoken to.
Eric had gone to Bob Chavis, and and I'm friends with Bob, or was friends with Bob when Bob was alive. And Bob encouraged him just to come forward and said, hey, if you'd have told the truth at the time, manslaughter, you'd be out of jail now. And that's what Bob told me. He told him, but he said that Stukel gave him nothing, and thus never hired him too.
Days later, Eric was arrested and charged with manslaughter.
Some say that due to the public push of this, the Pulse Group, suddenly in September of 95, within days of Eric Stukel's birthday, and the 3-year anniversary, really. The 3-year anniversary was the key date, and they made a big deal of that. Of course, the defense did in the trial. But anyway, an arrest was made of Eric Stukel.
On Friday, September 15th, 1995, Eric pled not guilty. Bail was set at $50,000. A $5,000 cash bond was secured and Eric was released, and the state of Nebraska was committed to trying a highly circumstantial case. There was hope, however, as it would take months before the case could be tried, and investigators still had time to find the missing pieces and work through his alibi. On the same day Eric was charged, at 2 p.m., the server from the Frying Pan restaurant that heard Eric's confession, Josh, received a telephone call at his home. A male caller, whose voice he didn't recognize, asked for him and said, quote, "If you have anything to say about Yankton, don't say anything at all." Josh exclaimed, quote, "Excuse me?" And the caller hung up. Investigators were quick to point out that from 1:45 until 2:30, Eric Stukel was either in the county court or the sheriff's office in Hartington, Nebraska. Thus, it was not likely that he was the caller. The identity of this caller remains unknown. On September 17th, 1995, a prayer service was held at St. John's Lutheran Church. This is an excerpt from Pastor David Gunderson's prayer service.
3 years ago, a beautiful young lady named Tammy Hawes died. And Tammy's death, like the death of any young girl, caused a lot of heartache and sorrow for her family and for her friends, for this church, and for this community. And as a community that wants to care, you tried to wrap your arms of compassion and care around Tammy's family. You came to this house of prayer to comfort her family, to turn to God's Word for the hopeful message, the message of hope and comfort we have in our risen Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and we needed to hear that message then as we do every day of our lives. But you also came with a prayer in your hearts, a prayer that the mystery surrounding Tammy's death, a mystery of how and when and why, could be resolved and answered quickly. You prayed that the law enforcement agents would soon come to an answer. But instead of the truth being told, instead of answers, we seem to have only heard silence. And as time went on, that silence continued to grow. And with the silence also grew a lack of concern. Because life went on. And so did our lives. We had bills to pay, children to get to and from school. We had jobs to do. And slowly that concern and compassion began to be replaced by a silent apathy. We began to think that happened so long ago. We began to say to one another, it wasn't my daughter. It wasn't my child. We began to accept rumors instead of fact. We began to accept the silence instead of the truth. We began to live with our fears instead of facing them. And that wasn't good. That wasn't good for this community, and it was certainly not good for those individuals directly involved with this tragedy. Those individuals who kept wanting to keep it silent, who knew the truth, who knew at least something of the truth, and yet wanted to bury it away, who wanted to lock it behind a closed door and hope that no one would drag it out, hope that they could keep it there, silent. But that would do them no good. And it would do this community no good. Because even though they might keep it silent from the rest of us, they could not keep it silent from God. And although they might keep it hidden from us, they could not keep it hidden from themselves. And it would always be there to haunt them, and to bother them, and to eat away at them. There are some secrets, my friends, that are not meant to be kept secret. We cannot replace the truth with rumors and with lies. Because only when the truth is spoken can the healing begin.
After the conclusion of the ceremony, a tape-recorded song written and produced by Jeff Heinen debuted with a short video of Tammy dancing ballet, along with 2 live ballet dancers performing a tribute to Tammy. The charges would represent a new hope for the Hawes family, her friends, and a community stricken for answers. On the next episode of Footsteps in the Dark, Season 1, Tammy Hawes, Episode 5, The Trial.
It's alright to cry when you're feeling sad. When I think of all the things we had.
Although Tammy's case has grown cold, that doesn't mean that it's closed. The FBI and Yankton Police Department continue to seek information in the death of Tammy Hawes. If you have information, you have options. Call the FBI's Sioux Falls Resident Agency at 605-334-6881, the Yankton Police Department at 605-668-5210, submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov, or lastly, send us a message. Someone knows what happened to Tammy, and maybe you know how to help solve the mystery. This podcast was written and produced by me, your host, Chad Zimmerman. The song featured in the trailer, Tammy's Ghost, was written and features John Salap on vocals, guitar, and bass, Matt Gedney on guitar, Adam Jones on drums, and Laura Egan and Carl Graber on horns.